Queridos amigos,
Dear friends,
y con qué gusto lo digo,
and I say this with tremendous pleasure, dear friends,
de cuantas cosas nobles
all the
han sido
noble things
producto de la preocupación de la humanidad
that have concerned humanity have been mentioned here
durante un ya largo tiempo.
for some time now.
Los valores por los cuales ha combatido la humanidad
The values for which humanity has
a lo largo
fought
de este siglo
and
que
struggled
concluye
throughout this century that is coming to an end
de una forma
have been expressed
o de otra
one way or
ustedes.
another by you.
Las cuestiones que más han preocupado en esta larga
The
lucha
issues
por la
that have concerned us
independencia,
most with respect to this long struggle
colonialismo,
for independence,
contra
against
el neocolonialismo,
colonialism, against neo-colonialism, against imperialism,
la lucha de los pueblos por la igualdad, por
the
la
struggle of the
justicia,
peoples
por el
for
desarrollo,
equality, justice, development,
por la soberanía,
sovereignty,
nunca tan amenazada como hoy.
threatened today more than ever before,
La lucha por la justicia
the struggle
social,
for social justice,
la lucha contra la explotación, la lucha contra la
the struggle
pobreza,
against exploitation,
la
the
lucha
struggle
contra la
against
ignorancia,
poverty, the struggle against
la lucha contra
ignorance,
las
the
enfermedades,
struggle against diseases,
la lucha en favor de todos aquellos
the struggle
desprotegidos,
in favor of all the dispossessed,
la lucha por la dignidad, por
the
la
struggle
igualdad,
for dignity, equality,
la lucha por el
the
respeto a la
struggle
mujer,
for respect
la lucha
toward
por la
women,
hermandad entre todos los
the struggle
hombres de
for
todas las
fraternity among men of all races,
razas, la lucha por la
the
paz,
struggle for peace.
todos esos valores y muchos
All of these values and many more
se han visto
have been
expresados aquí
expressed here
a lo largo del encuentro.
during this meeting.
Por ello podríamos decir
And
que
for that
no solo fue un
reason,
encuentro
we can
de
say
solidaridad con
that it has
Cuba,
not only been a meeting of
y nos
solidarity
orgullece
with
que haya
Cuba,
sido esa solidaridad
and we feel
el motivo
proud
de la
for the
inspiración.
fact that that solidarity served
Por aquí
as
han desfilado.
inspiration.
El bloqueo se convirtió en punto
The
prácticamente
blockade
central
became the
de este
focal
evento.
point of this meeting.
Sobre el bloqueo han hablado mucho.
Many have
Sobre el bloqueo,
referred to the
dijeron
blockade.
los compañeros.
The comrades have
No
referred to the
habría mucho que
blockade.
añadir,
Little could be added to that.
pero en esencia, ¿qué es el bloqueo?
But what is the blockade in
El
essence?
bloqueo no es solo
The blockade
la prohibición
is not
por parte
only,
de Estados Unidos
the banning
de realizar
of
cualquier tipo de comercio con nuestro país,
holding any type of trade with our country on the part of the U.S.,
llámese
be it
tecnología,
technology, machinery,
llámese algo más, alimento,
foodstuffs,
llámese algo más, medicina.
for instance,
El
medicines.
bloqueo significa que
The
a Cuba
blockade
no se le puede
means
vender ni siquiera una aspirina
that-
para aliviar un dolor de cabeza.
Not even an aspirin can be sold to Cuba to mitigate a headache,
O
or
un anticancerígeno
an anti-cancer drug
que pueda salvar una vida
that may save a life,
o que pueda aliviar el sufrimiento
or that may
en una fase
mitigate the suffering of those who are
de la vida.
in a terminal stage.
Nada,
Nothing Absolutely nothing can be sold to Cuba. The blockade is not only prohibiting all sorts of credits, financial facilities. The blockade is not only a total closure on the part of the United States of trade, commercial, financial activities by the United States, the richest, most powerful nation of the world in economic and military terms. At 90 miles away from our coasts, rather at 1 inch of our coasts, in the occupied territory of the Guantanamo Naval Base. But that is not the only thing. That is not what the blockade is. The blockade is also an economic war against Cuba. An economic war. It is the tenacious harassment, the constant harassment around the entire economic activities of Cuba anywhere in the world. The United States actively works through its diplomatic channels, its embassies, to exert pressure on any country that wishes to trade with Cuba. To exert pressure on any firm that wishes to trade or invest in Cuba, to exert pressure and punish any ship that transports goods to Cuba. It is a universal war with that immense power to their favor against the economy of our country, to the extent of doing individual arrangements, even with people, with individuals who try to carry out some sort of economic activity with our country. They euphemistically call it embargo. We call it blockade. And it is neither an embargo or a blockade. It is a war. A war that now is not being waged against any country in the world, but exclusively against Cuba. But during these years of revolution, we have not only had to bear with the blockade, we have had to bear the unceasing hostility in the political field from attempts to assassinate leaders of the revolution going through all forms of subversion, destabilization, and even direct, constant sabotage against our economy. We, in these 35 years, have been the victims of sabotage of all sorts. I will not only speak of pirate attacks,
invasiones mercenarias,
mercenary invasions,
guerras sucias
dirty wars
en las montañas,
in the mountains,
en los llanos,
in the plains,
intentos continuados de desestabilización
constant
en todos los terrenos,
destabilization attempts in all fields.
sino que hemos sido objeto de
But
sabotaje
rather,
directo,
we have been the object of direct sabotage
con explosivos,
with explosives,
con elementos incendiarios,
incendiary means.
Nuestro país ha sido incluso
Our country
víctima
has even been
de
victim
guerras químicas,
of chemical warfare
con la introducción de elementos
with the
tóxicos,
introduction of toxic elements,
de guerras biológicas,
of biological warfare
con la introducción de
with
enfermedades
the
en las
introduction
plantas,
of diseases in our
en los
plants,
animales
in our animals,
y en los seres
and
humanos.
among human beings.
No hay arma, no hay
There is
recurso
no weapon,
que no se haya
no
empleado
means
contra nuestro
that
país,
they have
contra
not
nuestra revolución,
used against
parte
our country and against our revolution
de las autoridades y del gobierno
on the
de
part
Estados
of the authorities and the government of the United States.
La guerra contra la revolución cubana
The war against the Cuban Revolution
ha sido total,
has been total,
absoluta. Y no es una
absolute.
vieja guerra,
and it is not an old
esa
war.
guerra se mantiene
That war is maintained,
y en la actualidad realizan,
and at present
gestan planes
they are drawing up,
de
they are
sabotaje
preparing
a nuestra
plans
economía,
to sabotage our economy,
a nuestras industrias
our
estratégicas.
strategic industries.
En la actualidad,
present,
organizaciones muy afines
Organizations
al gobierno de
quite
Estados
related
Unidos
to the government of the United States
actividades de
are
preparación
carrying out activities around the preparation of assassination attempts against the leaders of the revolution itself. Do not believe that these are things of the past. This is something of the
y planes de
present
guerra sucia,
and dirty war plans and plans for the infiltration of armed
para matar,
mercenaries to assassinate,
para sabotear,
to do sabotage,
para crear
to
inseguridad,
create
para
uncertainty,
llevar la muerte
and to bring
a cualquier rincón
death
de nuestro país.
to all
Digo y
corners
digo con
of our
toda
country.
responsabilidad,
I say this, and I say this very responsibly.
planes
These
actuales
are
del imperialismo.
plans of imperialism of this very moment against us.
Es algo más,
That is something more
algo mucho más que el bloqueo.
something much more than the economic blockade.
Y toda esta política
And all this policy
viene acompañada de una
is
incesante
accompanied
campaña de
by a
calumnia y
constant
difamación
campaign
contra nuestro
of
país
slanders and lies against our country
para justificar
to justify
sus crímenes.
their crimes.
Y ahora el énfasis
And now
fundamental lo ponen en el banderín
Their main emphasis
de los
is in the
derechos humanos.
banner of human rights.
Derechos humanos
Human rights
en boca de los que han cometido
in the mouth
y cometen
of those who have committed and are committed terrible actions against our country. As we were recently telling the High Commissioner of the UN on Human Rights, with whom we talked at length, the most brutal and most cruel violations of the human rights of our people.
la que se comete con el intento de matar
is
y rendir por
committed
la enfermedad.
with the attempt to make our people
A 11
yield out of hunger
millones
and diseases,
de
a
cubanos.
people made up of 11 million Cubans.
Estados Unidos,
The United States.
hablando
The United
de
States,
derechos humanos.
speaking of human rights,
Cuando empezó por exterminar
when they began
a
by
los antiguos habitantes
exterminating the
de ese país,
first inhabitants of that country,
expandieron el Estado
they expanded the state
a costa de los
at
territorios de
the
otros
expense of the territory of others.
y se extendieron
And they
arrebatando
expanded
tierra.
by taking land from them.
Y así despojaron a los vecinos
And that way,
de una forma o de otra.
one way or another,
Cuántos
they took away
millones de
from their
kilómetros
neighbors
cuadrados de tierra.
millions of square
Solo a
kilometers
México
of land.
le
Only in the case of
arrebataron más de la
Mexico,
mitad de su
they took
territorio.
more than half of Mexico's territory.
A Puerto Rico lo tienen todavía ocupado.
In the case of Puerto Rico, they still have it occupied.
A Cuba hace más de 150 años.
In the case of
quisieron
Cuba,
devorarse.
they wanted to devour Cuba more than 100 years ago.
En países de América Latina
In countries of
intervinieron
Latin
decenas de veces.
America, they intervened tens of times.
A Panamá le impusieron el
In
canal.
Panama, they imposed the canal on them.
Eso por no hablar más que de nuestro hemisferio.
Just to mention our hemisphere,
No me estoy refiriendo a la
I'm
guerra
not referring here
de Vietnam,
to the
ni
Vietnam
Laos,
War or the war in Laos or Cambodia or these other places.
Y no hay que remontarse a los pasados tiempos.
It is
En
not
los
necessary
tiempos modernos, desde que
to
la
go too
revolución
far into the past. In contemporary times, since the revolution has existed, what has been the history of the foreign policy of the U.S., the champion of liberty, the champion of human
La
rights,
alianza estrecha con los regímenes más
the
represivos
closest alliance with the most
y más
repressive,
sangrientos que han
bloody
existido en el mundo.
regimes that have ever existed throughout the world.
Pensamos en Europa,
If we think in terms of
recordamos que
Europe,
inmediatamente
we recall
después de la
that
Guerra
immediately
Mundial,
after
con la
the
alianza de
World
Estados
War,
Unidos
there was
con el
the
fascismo
alliance
español.
of the United States with Spanish fascism,
que fue instaurado con las armas de
which was
Hitler
inaugurated with
y
the
Mussolini,
weapons of Hitler and Mussolini,
y que costó millones de vidas
and that cost millions of lives
con finanzas.
until the end.
No podemos pasar por alto su alianza con el rey.
We cannot but mention their alliance with the regime of South Vietnam and their genocidal war
contra el pueblo,
against
en el sur,
the Vietnamese people in the south
norte.
and in the north.
No podemos pasar por
We
alto la guerra
cannot
de
but
Corea,
mention the Korean War,
país que fue
a
totalmente
country that
arrasado
was totally leveled down
convertido en polvo.
transformed into dust.
No podemos
We
ignorar
cannot
Hiroshima y Nagasaki.
ignore Hiroshima or Nagasaki.
Con el empleo innecesario de
With the
armas nucleares.
unnecessary use of nuclear
Empleo
weapons,
absolutamente innecesario.
totally unnecessarily,
Y que en todo caso podría
and that
haber
in any
sido
case
utilizada
could have been
contra
used
alguna instalación
against
militar,
some military facility,
y que cayeron sobre
which fell
poblaciones
on
civiles de
civilian
miles de habitantes,
populations,
para
millions of
instaurar la
inhabitants,
era del terror
to
atómico
establish the era of atomic terror
en el mundo.
throughout the world.
No podemos olvidar
We
la
cannot
alianza
forget
con Sudáfrica y
Their
el
alliance
apartheid.
with South Africa and apartheid.
No podemos olvidar incluso que el
We can't
apartheid
even
fabricó
forget
armas nucleares.
that apartheid manufactured
Cuando
nuclear
nosotros
weapons.
luchábamos
And when we were fighting in South Angola
contra el ejército
against
del apartheid,
the apartheid
junto a los
army,
angolanos,
together with the Angolans,
ya Sudáfrica tenía
South Africa
armas nucleares,
already had nuclear weapons,
varias armas nucleares. y los
several
Estados Unidos
nuclear
sabían que
weapons.
Sudáfrica
And the
tenía armas
United
nucleares,
States knew that South Africa had these nuclear weapons,
y que esas armas nucleares
and that
podían
these
ser empleadas
nuclear
contra
weapons
soldados
could be used
cubanos
against human soldiers,
y angolanos.
Cuban and Angolan soldiers. But it was South Africa. It was racism and fascism
Ellos que han
They
generado gran escándalo
that have created a tremendous scandal
y están amenazados
and have even
con la
threatened
guerra
with war
por la supuesta idea
because of a supposed
de que los
idea
norcoreanos querían desarrollar armas nucleares.
that the North Koreans wanted to develop nuclear weapons, and they allowed and they consented, and through indirect means
facilitaron
they facilitated
la construcción de armas
the
nucleares por parte.
building of nuclear weapons on the part of South Africa.
Pero si nos
But
acercamos a
if
nuestro
we
continente y
come
en
closer
esta
here
continente,
to our continent, in more recent times,
¿quién puede olvidar la
who
guerra sucia de
can
Nicaragua,
forget Nicaragua's dirty war,
organizada a través de mercenarios,
organized through armed mercenaries
costó la vida
that
de
meant
decenas de miles de nicaragüenses?
the death of tens of thousands of Nicaraguans and the mutilation of thousands of Nicaraguans. Who can forget that?
El campeón de la libertad,
The champion of liberty,
el campeón de los derechos
the
humanos.
champion of human rights.
¿Quién puede olvidar
Who
la
can
guerra
forget
sucia del Salvador?
The dirty war in El
El
Salvador,
apoyo del gobierno de
the
Estados
support
Unidos
of the U.S. government
a un gobierno
for a
genocida
genocidal government
al que entregó miles de millones en armas
to which they
sofisticadas
delivered tens of millions in sophisticated weapons
para aplastar la rebelión
to
del
crush
pueblo.
the rebellion of the people.
Guerra que costó más de
war
50.000 muertos.
That meant more than 50,000 deaths.
¿Y por qué tuvo lugar la
And
guerra de
why
Malvinas?
did the
Bien
Malvinas
sencillo,
War take place,
porque Estados
or
Unidos
Falkland Islands?
utilizaba
Simply because the
el
United
batallón
States
401,
used Battalion 401
las fuerzas especiales en Argentina,
of Special Forces in Argentina
para la guerra sucia contra
for their
Nicaragua,
dirty
la
war
guerra sucia
against
en El
Nicaragua
Salvador,
and their dirty war in El Salvador.
y le prestaban tan
And
brillante,
they rendered
agradable servicio
such
a
brilliant
Estados Unidos,
and pleasant service to the United
se
States
creyeron
that they thought
en la ocasión
it was
de ocupar
time
Malvinas.
to occupy Malvinas.
¿Quién puede olvidar lo que ha
Who
ocurrido
can forget
En Guatemala,
what happened in Guatemala
desde la época del gobierno de Arbenz,
since the period of
en los años
Arbenz
50,
in the 50s,
donde un gobierno popular elegido
where
por
a government of the people, elected by the people,
intenta hacer una reforma
attempted
agraria
to have an agrarian
para
reform
ayudar a los campesinos
to
y a las
help
comunidades
the
indígenas.
peasants and the native
Inmediatamente la
communities.
guerra sucia.
So then, immediately, a dirty war,
¿Qué ha pasado?
the invasion of mercenaries, and then
¿Qué
what?
ha pasado hasta hoy?
And what has happened up to today?
Más de 100.000
More than
desaparecidos.
100,000 missing.
Un país donde en
A
decenas de
country
años
where during
no existió la categoría
tens
de preso
of years, the category of political prisoner simply did not exist
desaparecido.
because they were all simply missing
Hasta hoy,
up to today.
¿quién suministró ese gobierno? ¿Quién
Who
suministró?
Offered supplies
¿Quién lo
to that
entrenó?
government?
¿Quién lo preparó?
Who trained that government?
El campeón de la libertad.
The champion of
El
liberty,
campeón de los derechos
the
humanos.
champion of human rights.
¿Y qué pasó en Chile?
And
Con el
what happened
gobierno
in
popular de
Chile
Salvador Allende?
with Salvador Allende's people's government?
Contra él conspiraron su economía fue de diversas
They
formas
conspired
bloqueada.
against him. His economy was under blockade in many different
Fueron
forms,
creando las condiciones para el
and
golpe
conditions started to be created for the coup.
que trajo al país miles y miles de desaparecidos,
Which meant thousands and thousands of missing people and people murdered.
y que pasó en Argentina
And what happened in Argentina
con aquel gobierno
with that
que mencionamos.
military government we were mentioning?
¿Y qué pasó en Brasil?
And what happened in Brazil?
¿Y quiénes apoyaron a los
And who
golpistas
supported
y a los que torturaban,
the putschists
asesinaban y desaparecían?
and those who tortured, murdered, and
¿Quién intervino
disappeared
en Santo
people?
Domingo
Who intervened in the Dominican
cuando la
Republic
rebelión
at the time of the
de Camaño?
Camaño rebellion?
¿Quién invadió Granada?
Who invaded Grenada?
¿Quién invadió Panamá?
Who invaded Panama?
Los campeones de la libertad
The champions of liberty
y de los derechos humanos.
and of human rights.
¿Cuál de esos países fue hostigado?
Which of these countries was harassed? Which of these governments
¿Cuál de
was
esos
harassed?
gobiernos
Which of
fue
these governments
bloqueado?
was blockaded?
Todos los que he mencionado.
Of all those I've mentioned,
¿A quiénes de ellos les negaron los créditos?
did they deny credits to
Comercio.
any of them? Or trade?
¿A quién de ellos defendieron de venderle armas y suministro de guerra?
Did they stop selling
¿A
weapons,
quiénes no
war supplies?
entrenaron
Who did they
la llamada
not train
acciones
in the
antisubversivas?
so-called anti-subversive actions?
¿A quiénes no entrenaron
Who did
en
they
el
not
arte del
train
crimen,
in the art of
la
crime,
desaparición
the missing
y las torturas?
and the tortured?
Y esos son
And these
los que bloquean a Cuba,
are the ones that are now
los que
are
calumnian
blockading
a
Cuba, slandering Cuba,
los que acusan a Cuba de
accusing
violación
Cuba of violations of human rights to justify their crimes against our people. And it is Cuba, and I say this with a cold mind, I say this without any subjectivity. Cuba is the country that has done most for the human being. What revolution has been more noble? What revolution was more generous? What revolution respected man most? And not as a victorious revolution in power, but since our very war, our very revolutionary struggle, in which we established principles that could not be violated, because what made us revolutionaries was to repel injustice, crime, tortures. And our war, which lasted 25 months, and it was very intense, where we captured thousands of prisoners, there was not one single case of physical violence against people to obtain information, not even in the middle of the war. There was not one single case of assassinating a prisoner. What we did with the prisoners was to let them go free. Naturally, we would take the weapons from them because we were interested in the weapons. And we treated them with all considerations that these weapon suppliers deserved. At the beginning, they had made them believe that we would kill them all. And some even resisted to the very end. But once they found out throughout the war what was the behavior of the rebel army, then it was easier for them to turn over their weapons. And in some cases, some of those soldiers turned themselves over 3 times because they would change them transfer him from one front to another front to another front. They would send him from one place to another. And they already had the experience. But the most important thing is that these principles of never resorting to torture, of never resorting to crime, these principles have been maintained without a single exception by the Cuban Revolution until today.
Digan lo que digan.
Whatever they say,
escriban
whatever they write, we already know that many of them, many of these writings were written by people paid by the CIA.
In the history of the revolution, there isn't a single case of a missing person or torture or political assassination.
Un solo caso de
A single
desaparecido.
case of a missing person.
No existen en nuestro país los llamados
In Cuba,
escuadrones de la muerte
there are
que
no
proliferan como
death
hongos
squads that proliferate like
en
mushrooms
muchos países de
in
este
many
hemisferio.
countries of this hemisphere.
En nuestro país no se conocen
In
estos
our
fenómenos.
country, we do not have these phenomena.
Vemos en otros
Phenomenons that can be observed in other countries
asesinados en
of children assassinated in the streets
a evitar el espectáculo de los monstruos.
in order to avoid for them to
La
beg for
revolución liquidó el pordioserismo.
in the streets. The revolution did away with the need
La
of
revolución
begging.
liquidó el juego.
The revolution did away with
La
gambling.
revolución liquidó las drogas.
The revolution did away with
La
drugs.
revolución liquidó la prostitución.
The revolution liquidated prostitution.
algunos casos,
Yes, there might be,
desgraciadamente,
unfortunately, there might be
algunas
still
tendencias
some cases, certain trends,
Por motivos de las dificultades
which,
económicas,
as a result of the economic difficulties,
la apertura del
and
país
as a
a
result
grandes
of the
contactos con el
country's
exterior,
opening to contacts
originan.
from abroad, they give
Puede haber
rise
algunas
to
jineteras.
prostitution, and there
No
might be
lo
some
negamos.
hookers. We do not deny this.
De vez en cuando por la Quinta Avenida aparece alguna que otra. pero
On Fifth Avenue, you may see them.
no hay que correr el riesgo
But
de confundir personas
You
decentes
cannot confuse
con
them
jineteras.
with decent persons.
Ay, se dan esos casos. Pero se lucha,
There are cases, however, we struggle against these
no se tolera la prostitución.
phenomenon. We do not
No se
tolerate
legaliza.
prostitution. It is not legalized.
La prostitución. No se ven hombres durmiendo en los
You don't
portales,
see men
ropados en periódicos.
homeless
A
sleeping
pesar
in the
de
streets
nuestra gran
and covered with the
pobreza
newspapers in spite of our poverty,
actual.
in spite of our current
No hay
poverty.
un solo ser humano
There
desamparado
isn't
y
a
sin
single
seguridad
homeless in our
social en
country
nuestro país.
without social security.
A pesar de nuestra gran
In
pobreza
spite of
actual.
our current poverty.
Los vicios que vemos todos los días en las sociedades
The
capitalistas.
vices that exist in capitalist society do not exist in Cuba.
En nuestro país eso ha sido
In
la obra.
our country, this is
No
the
hay un
work of
solo
the
niño
revolution.
Sin
There
escuela,
isn't a single child without a school
sin maestro.
and without teachers.
No hay un solo ciudadano
There
sin
isn't
atención
a
médica. Desde antes de
single
nacer,
citizen who is not entitled
aquí se
to
empieza
health
a atender al
services
ciudadano cuando está en el vientre
before
de la
they are born, because we began to care for our citizens before they are born, while they are still inside their mothers.
Desde la primera semana de su concepción.
Since the very weeks of their conception,
Somos el país del mundo
we are
de
The-
más médicos per cápita,
a country in the world, or
a pesar
the
del periodo especial.
country in the world with the most doctors per
El
capita,
país
in
del
spite of
mundo,
the
no digo del tercer mundo.
special, in spite of the special country, period. And I say not of Latin America, but I say of the world, beyond the Nordic countries and the Canadians, countries who occupy the prominent positions of health care services the world over. We are the country with the most number of professors and teachers per capita. In spite of all the difficult situation, we are the country in the world with the most cultural instructors per capita and sports and physical education professors in the world. And that is the country that they blockade. And that is the country that they want to surrender as a result of hunger and disease. The Constitution, we drafted the Constitution, and the electoral, we also drafted the electoral code, and this is what we have defended. In other words, the right of the country to establish the norms, the economic, political, social regime that they consider pertinent. Any other thing would be absurd, would be madness. And these madmen intend that for everyone else to do exactly what they do, and we do not like their system. They just elected a new Congress, where there is a trend towards a conservative position and towards an ultra-rightist position. However, these are the domestic problems of the United States. I assure you, I swear, that we have not told that posed as a condition for the United States in order to normalize relations that they should renounce to that system. Can you imagine if we told them that at least 80% of the population had to vote? 38% decided at the election, and that was it. And the others said, well, I'm going to the beach. Or maybe I'll go to the movies. Or maybe I'll stay home and rest. That happens among the champions of liberty and the champions of human rights and civil rights. And in many countries of Latin America, the same occurs. Many people do not go to the elections because the slaves and the serfs says, well, why should I vote if things will never change? However, at our elections, more than 95% of the population turns out, and no one is forced to vote. Not even those who are in favor of the revolution or against the revolution. They vote. They cast their ballot, a blank ballot. But I repeat, the neighbors are the ones who make the nominations. The people make the nominations, and the peoples are the ones who elect their candidates. So that's why I say that the possibilities for an ordinary citizen to be elected are infinitely greater than in other countries. Alarcón was explaining these issues when he recalled in a magazine that he was carrying, and he has the advantage that he speaks English and he's able to read American magazines. And he explained how a man had spent $25 million in his electoral campaign. What kind of democracy is that? How many people have $25 million to spend on an electoral campaign? And in Cuba, they do not even need to spend $25, perhaps the bus ticket to go to vote on election day. What kind of democracy is that, where you have to be a millionaire in order to be able to have the necessary resources to talk to the people and persuade them to elect them, and then they forget about him until the next election. They'll never see him again. In Cuba, the positions are renewed, and the delegate to a district can be elected, but he can also be revoked from his position. That is our system. We do not intend for the others to implement this system, but this is the system that we have adopted. No one came here to force it on us. No U.S. governor came here to establish a code here in Cuba as they used to do before. At the victory of the revolution, there was a bipolar world. The United States imposed the blockade at practically at the very beginning, and they began to eliminate the sugar quota. They also suspended the oil supply. Can you imagine a new revolution under those conditions? Of course, they also suspended the supply of spare parts and machinery, etc. However, the Soviet Union and the socialist countries existed. It was fortunate for Cuba, because in the face of the U.S. blockade and the presence of the United States only 90 miles away from our country, there was another force, another movement in the world with a revolutionary essence and origin, which was in contradiction with U.S. imperialism. And thanks to this, we were able to find a market for our sugar. We were able to find oil supply, foodstuff. As was explained here, it occurred that the socialist countries and the Soviet Union collapsed, and the blockade worsened. With the existence of the Soviet Union and the socialist countries, we felt better. We were able to resist better, and our economy resisted through 30 years and was able to reach an extraordinary social development. However, at the time of the birth of the Cuban Revolution, there was no other alternative in a country under a blockade by the most powerful country in the world. That is why the elimination or the disappearance of the socialist countries and the Soviet Union represented a terrible blow for Cuba, because the blockade was not only maintained, but it was enhanced. So our country lost 70% of its imports. And I ask myself if any other country in the world could have resisted. such a blow. And I also ask myself, how long could they have resisted? How many days? A week? 15 days? A month? How could they have resisted if it were not with the support of the people? And the support of the people? How could we have resisted, truly resisted, if it were it not that our democratic system, without the direct participation of the people in the fundamental issues, which is, in essence, true democracy?
Any other Latin American country could have resisted the brutal drop of 70% of its imports? Could any other European country been able to bear or pass such a test? Politicians would have yielded even one day before. They would have capitulated. But we have dignity, we have a sense of honor, and we are dear to principles. For us, principles are more worth than life itself. And we have never negotiated one single principle. Look, when we were helping the Central American revolutionaries, the North Americans said that they would lift the blockade if we stopped assisting the Central American revolutionaries. We never even thought of such a thing. At times they said that they were ready to lift the blockade if we stopped assisting Angola and other African countries. And that possibility of negotiating our relations with, for this, had never came to our mind. At times they also said that they would lift the blockade if we severed our bonds with the Soviet Union. And we never dreamed of such a thing, because we are not a party or political leadership that negotiates principles, and at that price. The blockade would be eternal, because it is a price that we are simply not willing to pay. How many hundreds of thousands of children have we educated with our teachers abroad? We have not only sent professors of elementary school or junior high schools and even university professors. We have established medical schools in many countries of the world. Is it fair to blockade a country that does that? A country that has done that and is still doing it to a certain extent? More than 15,000 Cuban doctors have offered their services free of charge in tens of countries during the revolution. More than 15,000 doctors have participated in internationalist missions as doctors.
More
than 26,000 teachers and professors. I ask myself, has any other country or even intermediate, maybe large country, has had this record. Suffice it to say that at a given moment we had 3 times more doctors working free of charge abroad in the third world than the World Health Organization. At a given moment, we had here 25,000 foreign students in scholarships in Cuba. It was the country of the world with the highest per capita in foreign students in scholarships. And we were not advertising that. We were simply doing our duty, simply as Martí taught us. We are making changes, but without renouncing independence or sovereignty. We make changes, but without renouncing the true principle of the government of the people, for the people and by the people. Which, translated to revolutionary terminology, is the government of the workers, for the workers and by the workers.